And at the beginning of the school year, it's super important for us to start off really strong. So the sort of what now is making sure that we have that actual manual finished, right? That's a big product. The manual's got to be ready to roll the start of the next school year. So when you get to the end and you see my list of things that is going to be kind of your next steps, that's number one, because that manual is what you're going to use in your professional learning for your staff to orient them. It's your permanent product, right? And then we'll give you a deck that you can use to train your staff on tier one, which is going to be super helpful for you to think about using with your staff and then adapting it for other groups to use. And then lastly, sometimes it's good to share what's coming up. So while they'll get oriented to school-wide language, they'll get oriented to the norms and skills matrices that you've built, they'll get oriented to what this looks and sounds like in the classroom. What you also want to let them know is kind of what's coming next, that they will get more evidence-based practice professional learning throughout the school year with follow-up coaching, and start to embed that general expectation throughout your school staff, especially, so that they can see that this isn't just a 1 hour PL and then we're done, right? This is going to be cyclical, and we'll keep walking you through this from the Basque side of things in the Echo series next year. On the next slide, I'll talk a little bit more about what it looks like in terms of the where and the when. So the where is really going to be audience dependent. In my experience with staff at the beginning of the school year, it's typically wherever you hold your staff PL, your whole staff PL. Usually it's a library, a cafeteria, whatever you have there, right? But what I'll say about that is your where can be super creative. You don't have to do a formal just 2 hour PTA session. You could do a bulletin board at the entrance of your school so that when family members come in and check in their students or drop them off, they see it, right? So what I would say at the early stages is be really creative about your where and your how, and don't feel like you're boxed into having to do things in a certain way. The when is also going to be a bit more dependent upon the audience. And what I did was I just scripted out what I did when I was a school-based administrator. So for staff, I usually tried to train them on my tier one framework before students arrived. So usually I had a day or two that the district gave me for professional learning, and I carved out an hour or two to orient them to kick off the tier one system. For students, ideally, whatever you do with students to orient them to the tier one system happens in the first week of school. So you really want to get them early and when they come back. And we do that for multiple reasons, but largely because tier one work is supposed to be preventative. So it's hard to be preventative if we've let them be in the building for a couple of weeks and then we've given them some sort of orientation, right? So students, I usually tried to do pretty early in my calendar for when they came back. Families or caregivers, I usually had my back to school night scheduled for the first month of school. So I put kind of within the first month there for that. And like I mentioned earlier, I would highly recommend using an existing format for reaching your families or caregivers. So whether you have a PTA or you already have a back to school night, don't think that you have to do something separate. This is just something that you can interweave into something you're already doing to reach families or caregivers. And then the broader community context, I think I mentioned that already, but that's going to be very context specific for your school. One school I worked at had what they called the interconnected meeting that happened once a quarter, where they brought in all the community members who were, really pertinent to that environment, including pastors, people who were in charge of the PAL group, that the police athletic group that worked with some students on basketball. Like, they brought in those people once a quarter, and they waited until that meeting in the first quarter to orient. Others didn't really have a community group built yet, so they decided to start small and just bring in one community organization. And guess what? They brought in that organization to the staff kickoff so they could hear it at the same time as staff members. They didn't schedule a separate meeting. They didn't schedule a separate kickoff. So my big message and tip and trick early is, when you're thinking about orienting folks next year and kicking this off, think about working smarter and not harder. Build onto something you're doing or invite additional people instead of seeing this as a million things you've got to do as you get started. On the next slide, we get to the next part of the presentation, which is where we talk a little bit about your resources. I mentioned the manual already. You have a version of your manual in your Google Drive for the Behavior Alliance. And really, that should be sort of your go-to written procedures for everything for your tier one MTSS for behavior for your school. I went in and popped in a few manuals today and looked in the drive, and some of you have your logo on the front already and the school year for next year already listed on there. And some of you have your matrices already listed in there. Those are all really good starts, but you want to have that ready to rock and roll for when staff are back in the buildings next school year. And then the other resource that you have that we're sharing with you today is a brand new Tier 1 MTSS-B staff kickoff deck. That deck, which will be a force copy and we'll drop in the chat in a little bit, I'm going to preview for you in the next few slides. So on the next slide, I just want to talk for a moment about the purpose of each of those documents. When it comes to a written manual, there are multiple purposes behind that written permanent product. First of all, it is a permanent product. It becomes part of the operating procedures of the school. And so we use that to orient all staff members when they come on board. I'm sure most of you have had experiences of staff members coming on board after the school year starts. This is a product that allows them to be oriented to what it's like to be part of the culture and the climate of our buildings. It's also used and referenced during the actual kickoff, whether it's physically or electronically. I've worked in school settings before as the leader where they were much more keen to having everything printed. So my teachers really wanted to have binders at the beginning of the year that they used in PLCs, and we did that, right? And then there were other places where we were 100% Google and we never used anything paper. So the big message would be you're going to reference that document regularly. So it's got to be accessible, whether it's printed and people use and bring back to PLCs later or bring back to your refresher that you do with your staff after winter break. It's going to be constantly referenced, because if at the beginning of the year I just share this thing like we often do with like student handbook type stuff, it's not really going to be used beyond just shared at the beginning of the year unless I go back to it, right? What you look for is what you're going to find. So keep referencing it and finding out ways to go back and reference that. And then lastly, that document, while it is a permanent product, is meant to be redeveloped every year, that manual. It's meant to be updated every single school year. So at the end of the day, it's advantageous for us to think about ways to either have that be something that we can update in the middle of the year, i.e. a Google document that you could update so then it's not static like a PDF document. But at the end of the day, it's really helpful to think about that document as not just, oh, it's done, I never touch it again. It's what we're going to use for the next 5 years. Every single year, it gets a new school year on it. It gets a little bit of an update based on what you learned and all of the action planning you do at the end of the school year, like you started to do this year. And then on the kickoff deck itself, the actual slide deck we're going to share today, the real goal is to provide that professional learning for what I think somebody said in the chat earlier, consistency, right? It's getting everybody on the same page. So it's meant to give everybody the expectations for the year. It also gives us that opportunity to everybody just start off fresh, same language, entire year, here's what you can expect, and then to provide explicit information about teaching. We're usually really good about, at the beginning of the year, giving explicit information about what a teaching schedule looks like when it comes to academics. Here's your 4th grade blocks, here's math, here's reading, here's whatever, right? We give the schedules for those for the whole year at the beginning of the year. Our goal is to model that same thing when it comes to behavior. In the first 2 weeks, for example, what does it look like to teach and where are we going to teach? But then also beyond that, when do we do it regularly? After extended breaks, on Mondays after kids have been out of the building for 2 days and their brains fell out, right? We've got to think really concretely about ensuring that people see behavior-related instruction as an ongoing thing, not a one-time thing that we just do in the first 2 weeks of school. On the next slide, I get into a little bit more of what that kickoff deck looks like. I only pulled a few slides for the kickoff deck, so I will acknowledge that the deck, like most of our resources, have a bunch more information than what I'm sharing today. The overall goal of your kickoff is to give them the guidance to implement Tier 1 within their settings, whichever students they're serving in their settings. Start off fresh at the beginning of the year. It's also to give them the resources they need. And then, like I previewed earlier, to give them that sort of carrot in their head that this isn't the only time they're hearing about this, that they're going to get some boosters of evidence-based practice in their PLCs or in later professional learning. And most importantly, that support is going to come after all of those things. So building in that norm for them that they're going to hear content and then see and feel someone after that doing either some fidelity checks, sending them a survey, asking them to visit their peers, just like you started getting used to with some of the evidence-based practice and coaching cycles this year. On the next slide, I talk a little bit more about the agenda for the actual presentation. So there'll be an introductory opportunity. There'll be a little bit around teaming and team norms. You'll have an opportunity to give them that foundational information about MTSS for behavior, and then you get into the nitty-gritty of your specifics for your school. In the deck, there's a lot of places highlighted in yellow where you just go and put in your own version. So you'll put in your own matrix, you'll put in a link to your own manual, you'll change the title so it says your school name. So when you start to get into, especially those last two 30-minute sessions, it's very applicable to your own school and to your own setting, and you make it your own. And then at the end of the day, we want to leave people with what they're going to see next. So there's a section at the end for your action steps and next steps. The deck itself has this slide at the beginning to give you an overview that anything in yellow is meant for you and really should be edited by you and your school team. But like all of our resources, we're not going to police these decks. These are yours. Go back and make them your own. Delete or hide what doesn't make sense to you, or add things that make more sense based on your context. So this is just to say this slide will be at the beginning of the deck, but it also gives you that information about the yellow boxes and to make this deck your own. Getting to the actual deck, hopefully somebody from our internal team wouldn't mind. Crystal, maybe you could drop the link in the chat for the force copy, but it's also on the link on the website that was shared earlier with the resources. The deck itself is a force copy link, so you'll have your own. And later after this session, it's going to magically show up in your Basque Google folder. And we also are going to be sending everybody on your school team a reminder email with a shared link to that folder so that everybody can get back to it in their email after today's session. I know it's a common thing that comes up as feedback from folks. So we'll make that announcement via email when that comes, so you have it and have that prompt back to your folder. But you'll have your own version of your own deck for your own school, and that's there for you to be able to access in the folder. It'll come in a week or so. Lastly, teaching schedules. We talked about this in day 3 a little bit when it comes to fidelity checks. So I've given you a couple quick boosters and giving you an idea about what I used when I was in a district. And then I'll end with some tips and tricks for you. So the little boosters I'm giving you is, first of all, teaching norms is very similar to teaching academic instruction. This wheel you saw in our professional learning on day 3, and Maya will click through and get all of it up for me because I'm not going to go through the wheel for you. My point is, our old school version of behavior-related instruction was often, let's go practice walking in the hall. Great, everybody can do it. Let's go back to the classroom. We've got to be creative about getting beyond that. We need to think about examples and not examples. We need to think about practice and embedded reinforcements and corrections after the actual instruction happens. And we have to think about differentiation. So my big message would be really creative about teaching at the beginning of the year and try to take your traditional approach of behavior instruction and students interacting with their physical environment as the only starting place and get beyond that. Hint, you'll hear some of my tips and tricks on that towards the end of the presentation. The next slide, in my experience, when I was school-based, I did have an actual teaching schedule. And in my teaching schedules, I had my staff members listed, and I also had what location I wanted them to go to on what days of the week and what time. And I, as the building administrator, was around my building a lot more visibly, especially in the first 2 weeks of school. And I took that schedule around everywhere that I went. Somebody on your school team could do the same thing, just to do some spot checks to make sure people are showing up and teaching when they're supposed to. But a good way to do this, especially within the classroom, is to say to teachers, listen, your time to establish your culture in your classroom and teach what the language that we're asking you to use, teach your classroom matrix, is on this day at this time. And we're going to be walking around to look and see and hear that happening. So the look and see and hear is our fidelity check to make sure that everybody is actually on board and doing those things. But also it's to acknowledge that educators aren't necessarily well prepared to teach behavior instruction in their preparation programs. So we have to be willing to jump in and help support with modeling and teaching and those practices as well when it comes to high quality behavior instruction. So there were times, especially with new teachers, that I jumped in and helped deliver some of that instruction in the classroom because the new teachers didn't know how to do that as well, right? So I'm thinking really concretely about how to do that and set the tone early in the year when it comes to what I would like to look for behavior. And yes, Tara, I completely agree when it comes to some of that fidelity checks. I'll talk on my tips and tricks slide about the principal being the key of all of this and what I would recommend, especially as a former building administrator myself. Next one, there's some walkthrough tools that we gave you at day 3 that I'm highlighting here again in the deck that you can find on our website for today's Echo session. These are clickable, so you can download them and make them your own. But the key point would be, it would be really useful if while you have your schedule and people are walking around, you had some way to collect some information about whether or not people are doing what they were scheduled to do. That data is great to share back with your staff to say, listen, we taught it. We told you we were going to look for it. We looked for it. And now here's what we saw and heard as a result of that. We saw 80% of people showing up to when they were scheduled to be there. Our goal was 80%. Great job, right? Like thinking about those data cycles we keep talking about, if we're going to give them an expectation and supports afterwards, it's great if we can collect some fidelity data along with that. I just put this slide here because in your deck that you have, there's a teaching schedule spot that is on the slide deck. And I put this orange box to say, my recommendation would be not to skip this slide. The tendency is to think, oh, fidelity is dirty or scheduling people out is dirty, right? Like that's the tendency. It feels a little weird. But at the end of the day, this is the only way we can actually give people the frame for ensuring that they actually are delivering the behavior instruction and then checking the fidelity on the back end. So my suggestion would be don't skip making a teaching schedule and follow up on that schedule at the start of the school year. And then lastly, overall tips and tricks that I'll leave you with. First of all, be creative. We give you the frame. Sarah from our team went through and gave you a bunch of activity ideas in that kickoff deck that you can use with your staff members. It's not exhaustive. So be really creative about what you're doing and what you're experiencing. Schedule everything out ahead of time. Did I mention scheduling in this presentation enough for you yet? Schedule it ahead of time, right? Get that clear and consistent schedule out for people. In addition to that, I would recommend creating a sense of excitement. This is the start of the school year. It started something new, right? It's something new, it's something exciting. There's always a little bit of a different energy at the start of the school year after everybody's had a chance to hopefully recharge their batteries over the summer. So it's an opportunity to start fresh. In that sense of excitement, it's also important to connect to the idea that this excitement is going to be maintained by follow-up supporting coaching. And that's an expectation of all of us in our building. That message starting off at the beginning of the year will help reduce some of the barriers that you might be encountering while trying to play in the sandbox of this school year. So start off the year by giving the message that you're going to see us present tier 1 information throughout the year. And then you're also going to see and feel and hear our team after the presentation of that information all the way throughout the school year. You'll see on bullet point number 4, there's a lot of literature out there about the administrator making or breaking the effectiveness of new or existing programs or systems within a building. The principal is key at the beginning of the year message. Even if your administrator is not up there delivering any parts of this presentation, my minimal recommendation would be that they get up there at some point and say, this is how we're doing things at our school building. Everybody's going to use this clear and consistent language. You're going to hear it from me. You're going to hear and see me around the building looking for, listening to, trying to hear the language being spoken throughout the building. So minimally, my recommendation is to ensure that you have somebody with administrative authority getting up there and saying, this is how we do things at our school, and I'm going to be looking and listening for it throughout the school year. And then lastly, I would highly recommend that you be creative at the beginning of the year in terms of competition elements. That is another really good way to get excitement started at the beginning of the school year, whether it's poster competitions, who can create the most creative poster that illustrates some of our school-wide language. video competitions with students, with adults. Those kinds of things really help engage, especially our students who learn and engage with technology really differently than most of us do or did when we were growing up. So we've got to think creatively about how to reach them. Competition is a great way to do that, whether it's a most creative poster award, or you get your teachers to create a video to teach what it means to be respectful in the cafeteria with a video, and give the teachers a little pass to leave a half hour early on a PD day, right? Like, think creatively about how you can create some products that lead to more than just the deck that we're providing as resources and information and ways to teach in different modalities. I believe the last slide I have for you is just a few next steps to highlight for you. First and foremost, if you haven't already, you've got to make sure your manual is in final format before you end the school year. That manual should be in your Google Drive for the Behavior Alliance, and your district behavior coordinator is going to be taking a peek at them at the end of the year just to make sure that you have everything you need. So make sure you have your manual ready to roll. In addition to that, now that we've given you this deck, you have some time before the school year lets out to at least start looking into the deck and start getting in and hiding slides, making new ones, deciding who's going to do what sections. But just look at the deck and make it your own. Use your team meeting in April, May, to start making some decisions about it. And then be ready next week when we come back to start chatting about the beginning of the school year tasks, because Crystal's creating with you, for you, before school starts, and Q1, quarter one timeline for you. That really is going to be a big part of next week's Echo session. I believe without further ado, that should be the last slide that I have, and I'll leave it open to any questions or comments folks have for me.
And feel free to pop them in the chat also if you don't feel comfortable unmuting, if you have any questions for Stephen. Thank you so much, Stephen. That was really, really informative and helpful. I'm sure that everyone will be able to use all those tools. And I hope you guys find the resources that we provided useful and helpful and easy to edit so that you can make them your own for the beginning of the school year. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and move towards our didactic section. If you think of any questions, though, don't feel comfortable putting them in the chat. That's perfectly fine as we move on. Thank you again, Stephen. Another thank you. And there's Stephen's email if you need to contact him. So we'll move on to our case presentation. Unfortunately, we didn't get a plan of practice this week from you all. We know this is a busy time with spring break and all the things going on. I know you guys are also prepping for testing, and I know that schools get lively towards the end of the school year. So we completely understand the time crunch as well. So we're going to be talking about some MTSS-B rollout challenges today, and we're going to be problem solving and brainstorming with you all on how to combat some of these challenges. So I'll go over and review a scenario, and then we're going to either, after we do some clarifying questions, if you have any, we'll share out either by unmuting, or we also have a Padlet for you all to pop some responses to some of these challenges as we collaboratively work together to think about these things. Okay, so the name of the challenge or the identified action is all talk, no follow through. So the concern is the leadership team shared tier 1 expectations and rollout plans at the back to school PD or PL, whatever you guys call it in your building. But now staff aren't using the reinforcement system or referring to expectations in lessons and following the schedule that